Well, I just reject your hypothesis.
People have been doing strange things in the name of making art for a long time. In 2012, Russian street artist Peter Pavlensky nailed his testicles to the ground. Chris Burden was crucified to a Volkswagen. Jared Leto famously and disturbingly mailed dead rats to his co-stars. And all of this is always excused under the bracket of creative license. Creative license is often used to add to the overall vision of a creative piece, whether that's a novel, a painting, a film. People can use this to change dates or ignore scientific realities in films about space or factual elements about a war. But all of it is in support of a bigger picture, something that the creator is trying to say through the medium that means they have to slightly bend the rules. But it's fine, because it has meaning, it has purpose, right? Roman Polanski is famously known for being accused of statutory rape, but fled to France to avoid the charges. In 2009, after the release of The Pianist, Polanski was given the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Zurich Film Festival, which took place in Switzerland. Polanski went to Switzerland to collect his award, and the Swiss police took this as an opportunity to arrest him because he had been evading capture for years. Harvey Weinstein was outraged by this, claiming that this was insulting to his contributions to the film industry by arresting him at this particular moment. He created an open letter expressing this outrage, with many other people from the industry signing it, including Woody Allen, Wes Anderson, Wong Kar-wai, and Guillermo del Toro. Guillermo del Toro has always shown a deep respect for the complexities of childhood and not sugarcoating the dark side of growing up. With this comes a certain respect towards children and not underestimating their intelligence. This is a key value that we see in a lot of his work, with many of his films centering around children. This brings up a huge question. Someone like Guillermo del Toro can say he respects children, but then supports a known child rapist. Similarly with Quentin Tarantino, who can claim he's a supporter of women, but then supports and defends abusers. This means that some artists are able to hide behind what they create, using progressive ideas to look good in interviews and encourage audiences to support them, with none of these ideas blending into their art. They claim to be different from the world they're part of, yet still work and flourish within the system without pushing back against it in any way, and actually profiting from these harmful ideas. It leaves us with this. Should we separate the art from the artist? Is creative license really an excuse? And how far will we go to defend geniuses? By looking at the work of Quentin Tarantino, this essay will look at the clash between creative and personal identity, and the age-old question, can we really like Tarantino? It comes as no surprise when I say that Tarantino's work has been met with a few controversies, whether that's his use of extreme violence, unsafe stunts on set, his treatment of women, and liberal use of racial slurs. And in the film world, people have varying opinions on his work and filmmaking practices. Some people watch Pulp Fiction and never felt the need to watch anything else again, claiming that it's the best film that's ever been made. Some people think he's a super underground indie filmmaker that only men have heard of. Some people respect his love for cinema, some people find his films insulting, some people think he's a feminist, some people find that idea insulting. However, he is able to continue with these practices because he is quote-unquote a genius. The tolerance of artists doing crazy awful things in the name of art can be defined by this graph, which I call the genius scale. It goes as such: an artist/creator is allowed to be X amount of crazy as long as they are equal parts genius. Note, this is not applicable to women. Women can be geniuses, but they can't be crazy or they get kicked out of the Genius Club. Note the treatment of Olivia Wilde on the fabled Italian leg of the Don't Worry Darling press tour. However, this scale is unlimited for men. You can pretty much do whatever you want, and if people think you're talented, no one will bat an eyelid. Here are a few examples. Today we're going to be focusing on one man in particular, Mr. Tarantino. Tarantino's films are known for their sprawling, non-linear storylines, dark humour, stylized violence, unique dialogue, and occasional retelling of famous historical events. But along with all these things and the many films he's made, he's also known for saying and doing some very questionable things. To name but a few, the extensive use of racial slurs in Django Unchained, homophobic slurs in Pulp Fiction, his public defending of Polanski and in turn rapists in general.
This director who raped a 13-year-old.
He didn't rape a 13-year-old. It was statutory rape.
Yeah, all right.
Well, he had sex with a minor. All right, that's not rape. Throwing the word rape around is like throwing the word racist around.
His recent comments about Harvey Weinstein, his treatment of actresses on set and unsafe stunts. His attitude towards collaboration is also questionable, given that he paid the co-writer of Pulp Fiction $25,000 in order to have sole writing credits, and even threatened him with legal action. We could also mention his use of feet in his filmography and saying, and I quote, "There's a lot of feet in a lot of good directors' movies. That's just good direction. Like, before me, the person foot fetishism was defined by Louis Buñuel, another film director, and Hitchcock was accused of it, and Sofia Coppola has been accused of it." So it's safe to say that he rejects this hypothesis of him having a foot fetish.
Well, I just reject your hypotheses.
Nice save, Quentin. I must have mistaken good direction for shots that actually have meaning. People might say, but isn't art a way of expressing new and sometimes daring concepts and ideas? If we can't make art about uncomfortable ideas, then where can we? I recently went to an exhibit of Paulo Rego's abortion series. For anyone who doesn't know, Paulo Rego is a Portuguese artist who in the 90s made a series of paintings showing women having unsafe abortions, as a way of criticising Portugal's criminalisation of them. And they're great paintings. But some of her other work was featured in this show, and I noticed that in quite a few of these paintings there was very racist imagery. In the descriptions of these paintings, they included her reasoning for these pieces, and she said this really bullshit response that basically said it wasn't racist and she just wanted to depict black people in this way. The idea of creative license has evolved into an excuse for people to use harmful ideas in their work at the expense of oppressed groups, without having to take any responsibility for it. And it's the same thing with Tarantino. He reasons the use of this explicitly racist language in his films as being down to creative license, except it's not down to white people to decide whether or not this language is offensive. Tarantino has said that if people don't like his work, then it's not for them. But then it raises the question of who is your work for? If the only people who aren't insulted by your work are the same as you, what does that mean? And if you're expressing these ideas in all of your work, then can it really be boiled down to creative license? This can be interestingly explored through Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which Tarantino himself has labelled as his most personal piece of work. But what does this reveal about him? Tarantino's most personal film was made about the golden era of Hollywood, the famously good times, filmmaking at its finest. Peter Biskind has some excellent anecdotes about these times in his book Easy Riders Raging Bulls, including the excessive drug use, lack of diversity, awful treatment of actors on set, nearly every woman being sexually assaulted, and most importantly, the lack of consequences for this behaviour, and general tolerance for men behaving very badly. It raises the question, who was this era golden for? If these very questionable ideas and practices are peppered throughout Tarantino's films, with each of these films building to his most personal film, it makes the content within that piece of work very revealing. This reference for the golden era of Hollywood is symbolic of something bigger. It's a way of trying to uphold and keep alive the values of the past, a time that was only golden for very few people like Tarantino. It shows this longing for the past in a time where there were no consequences and no competition. I think there are a lot of directors who are hiding behind their work in order to escape the consequences of saying shitty things, abusing the idea of creative license. To an extent, we're being manipulated into supporting creators by saying that these things are purely for the sake of filmmaking and they're just daring concepts. But in reality, on some level, they believe everything they're saying and they can't admit that publicly because ultimately they need fans and people that will continue to support them and pay to watch their films and buy their books. Think of it like this. When you write, it's like how you talk when you're drunk. It's unfiltered and free. So if writers are producing scripts with awful stuff that depicts certain minority groups or oppressed people in a certain way, and they repeat these ideas in all their movies, then I hate to break it to you, but that's probably quite an accurate depiction of their inner monologue. There has been a lot of feminist criticism on Tarantino's work, particularly regarding his treatment of women on set and the writing of some of his female characters. And you might be thinking, shut up you little rat, what about Kill Bill? Now, I was reading some fan forums about Tarantino as research for this video, and I noticed that a lot of men are using Kill Bill as a defense to these criticisms, claiming that his films are actually really great for women. Let's get into it. So some people think it's progressive and, dare I say it, a feminist movie because there's women fighting and killing people and seeking revenge, all whilst wearing a crop top. Radical. But here's the thing. What exactly about this makes it feminist? Because she's behaving like a man? And what is the messaging behind this if it's saying that the way to be empowered as a woman is to do stereotypically male things? Not to mention the fact that Uma Thurman herself has spoken about her experiences on set and how she was forced to do dangerous stunts, leading to extensive injuries. In an interview via the New York Times, Thurman expressed numerous abuses throughout her time on set. The director forced her to do the car crash scene even though she expressed concerns, and it resulted in a concussion and permanent knee damage for the actress. He's the one that spit in her face in the scene where Michael Madsen is supposed to do it. He's also the one that choked her with a chain when a teenager named Gogo was doing it on screen. Quentin Tarantino is a director who is known to push the limits, but he's taken it way too far on many occasions if even half the reported incidences from those that worked with him are true. So can a film even be feminist in theory if the filmmaking process isn't? Over the course of the film, the bride is seeking revenge on Bill, an old boyfriend that tried to kill her. On this journey, she fights her way to the top, killing people on the way and being generally violent. However, the bride's womanhood and gender is something both used against her and something she is trying to detach herself from. Her character is on this quest of proving her detachment from femininity and not fitting into these conventional female stereotypes. Her journey through the film is her trying to prove herself as worthy as a woman and someone to be taken seriously, all by behaving like a man. But there's nothing wrong with being a woman, and the idea that she can only be empowering and worthy by fighting and killing furthers this idea that femininity is uncool and women can only be cool by removing themselves from these ideas and behaving like men. In Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, she talks about how women are defined entirely in relation and opposition to men, without being able to achieve self-fulfillment on their own, which is shown through the narrative in Kill Bill. The film, rather than providing a self-derived and self-defined virtue to the bride's motivation for revenge, deduces her character's motivation to her female physiology, and in its direction style draws attention to the fact that the bride is adopting practices which are traditionally reserved for men. Thus, empowerment in this sense is less defined by Beatrix's tactful and skilled fighting capabilities, and more by the fact that she can perform practices that are traditionally reserved for men. It's interesting that the film both separates her character from her gender by asserting her worth through male behaviours, whilst also using her feminine appearance to appeal to the male gaze. It very much fits into the cool girl trope explored in Gone Girl, where she's cool because she behaves like men but has erotic capital because she's an attractive woman that is written for the male gaze. The male characters in Kill Bill also use the bride's gender as an insult, whilst also objectifying her, showing that no matter what she achieves, she cannot escape the fact that she is seen as a sex object and will be reduced to misogynistic slurs. Ultimately, Tarantino is saying that this character can be cool and someone the male audience can be attracted to, but she is not deserving of respect because ultimately, she is just a woman whose main purpose is to be attractive. Throughout the movies, Beatrix is projected to the audience from the lens of the male agents that define her as a blood-spattered angel, a blonde and so on, while she continuously attempts to defy their assaultive gaze even in her weakest and most passive moments. Beatrix's assertion of a female avenger is reiterated only when it conforms to the standardized masculine perception of an action hero. So it would seem like Kill Bill isn't quite the feminist masterpiece that everyone claims it to be, and these ideas also extend to the rest of Tarantino's work. Many of Tarantino's films relish in the abuse of its heroines, fetishizing female pain and trauma, but he has also been praised for showing women beating up men, something that is apparently progressive and empowering. In The Hateful Eight, Daisy is repeatedly beaten up by the men around her, in increasingly horrific and awful ways, but all played for comedic effect.
Ha ha, laugh, funny.
That's funny?
To me, it's funny. Yeah, do you have a sense of humor?
But what exactly is subversive about seeing a woman being beaten to a pulp? In the article, Really Tarantino, What's Up with the Misogyny, the writer says, why did the men in the cinema find the sight of a woman being beaten to a pulp so hilarious? By chortling, are they condoning misogyny, or have we, as a society, just become desensitized to the demeaning of women and the type of behaviour that should be abhorred? If so, that's truly frightening. We are not at a place where joking about women being beaten up and assaulted by men can be seen as progressive, subversive comedy, especially when it's being written by men who are the cause of these very real threats for us in the first place. Again, it's the same argument of men thinking that saying misogynistic comments as a joke isn't sexist. It would seem that according to Tarantino's version of feminism, equality is being able to freely beat up women, because if we're equal, then it's not really that bad, right? It pains me that men's response to equality is that they should be able to assault us without consequences. You belong in jail. However, some men on this unfortunate fan forum I was reading were excusing this violence because of the girls that beat up some guy at the end of Death Proof. They said, and I quote, "Imagine it the other way round." Oh, I could scream. Women are dying as a result of male violence every single day, and there's a very real history of women being subjected to this. It isn't some fun little thing you can pop into a movie for a joke. I can imagine it the other way round because when I check the news and check Twitter and hear more horrible stories about girls walking home from school and being murdered for not giving a guy their phone number. So Kill Bill and the Hateful Eight aren't great. What about his other female characters? Do they at least have some cool lines whilst they get beaten up? I could go into Sharon Tate's character, but I'm sure Tarantino would
Reject your hypotheses.
Or maybe I shouldn't say anything at all because that's the entirety of her character. Sharon Tate was a talented actress and someone with thoughts and ideas, and the idea of her being this person that just walks around smiling with nothing to say is a really two-dimensional portrayal, even if she was a genuinely happy person in real life. And I think it's funny that they talked about how her character was the heartbeat of the film and how she injected life into everything, because I just can't imagine a male character being created to do this. Can you imagine a male character that exists solely as a pretty guy who wears nice outfits while smiling and taking his shoes off in public? Now imagine that role being played by someone like Leonardo DiCaprio. It would be insulting. Yet you have Margot Robbie, who's easily one of the most talented actresses of our time, playing this role. This kind of quote-unquote main character role would never be written for a man. Fucking fuming. Tarantino indulges in the male fantasy in the creation of all his female characters. Guys like his movies because of the shootouts, car chases, drugs, and cool girls that also do drugs and shoot guns, except they're entirely defined by the relation to the men in their lives, and their feet. The Tarantino universe is a young boy's wet dream. Recently I watched Tar, and like many people, I really loved it. It talks about the dangers of worshipping geniuses and the toxic, invincible creator. And in relation to Tarantino, I think it acts as a pretty good springboard into my next argument. Lydia Tarr was trying to convince herself that her gender identity didn't affect her work. She tried to separate her personal and creative identity in order to cope with the fact that she wasn't a good person. But ultimately, the reason why she faces the consequences of what she's done is because she's a woman. I talked about this in my bare minimum essay, but people are always waiting for women to fail or mess up or find reasons to think they have and tear them down the minute they have the chance. Look at nearly every woman in the public eye, who have been worshipped one minute and the next, everyone hates them. Ultimately, people like Tarantino can do whatever they want, because the idea of cancel culture only exists for certain people. Because they're white men and fairly right-wing, they won't be affected by this. Name one person like him who is actually being cancelled. There's no one. And you can't say Harvey Weinstein, he wasn't cancelled, he went to literal jail. I recently saw a tweet from Otega Uwagba who spoke about Andrew Tate and the freedom he was given to express his views, all because they're just opinions and we have freedom of speech. But if left-wing people were saying anything quote-unquote extreme, they wouldn't be given a platform or defended for freedom of speech, which is a whole other thing. Freedom of speech only seems to exist with people expressing oppressive ideology. For example, the Dixie Chicks were maybe the first people to be publicly cancelled after they spoke out about George Bush and the invasion of Iraq. It became an industry term that if you expressed any leftist opinions, you would be cancelled like the Dixie Chicks. It took over 20 years before they could perform again and be taken seriously as a group. The only people that are really cancelled are the ones that don't need to be. Left opinions are constantly met with backlash and labelled as being extreme and unreasonable, but extreme right and actually harmful ideas are given platforms under the guise of freedom of speech. Polanski is still kicking about in France. He will never be cancelled. Same for people like Woody Allen, Piers Morgan, Jeremy Clarkson and Andrew Tate. They talk about this threat of being cancelled, but that will never happen because the media protects and enables people like them because it benefits people in power to have oppressive ideology as part of mainstream discourse. Look at all the angry little men who are furious about Andrew Tate's TikTok account being removed. It's like you can't even admit to sexual assault and human trafficking anymore without being cancelled by the woke mob. This is also completely different depending on the race of the person involved. If any one of these men had not been white, they would have been immediately ostracised and shunned by the public. Lizzo recently spoke about how cancel culture has been appropriated, which I completely agree with. It was created by people of colour to be this empowering thing that would help bring justice and hold people accountable for oppressing minorities. But now it's been twisted into this thing that doesn't hold any power over people who deserve it. Will Smith is a perfect example of this. Someone who was cancelled for something that in the grand scheme of things isn't that bad, at least compared to things that his white counterparts are doing and not facing any consequences for. Any of these men that do awful things will not be cancelled. They will only claim they're being cancelled to play the victim and pretend they're being faced with such a large injustice for speaking their truth. Or they claim they're being cancelled for saying things that no one actually cares about, as a way of invalidating genuine concerns from left-wing liberal people. For example, these ridiculous debates on the morning show where they choose an aspect of a current issue that no one cares about and say, liberals are outraged at this, when in reality, maybe one person on Twitter said something and they blow it up to make it seem like we care about petty things. Gina Martin called this minimizing by absurd distraction. Cancel culture has been twisted into this thing that works to silence people that are already oppressed, manipulating people into thinking that extremist people are being victimized in silence, while still allowing them to have a platform to say extremely damaging, awful things. How many women need to die before we realize that if a man is bragging and joking about assault, then he's a real threat and not just expressing opinions? In the UK, a woman dies every 3 days as a result of male violence, but Brad Pitt is still at the Golden Globes and being praised by every other person on stage. Hollywood is enthusiastically pretending that his abuse allegations don't exist. Because in Hollywood, no one cares what you've done, as long as you're good in the movies. That's showbiz. We've all been there. You meet a guy, you think he's so cute and nice, and then you ask him what his favourite film is and he says, "Oh, this little indie film called Pulp Fiction, have you heard of it?" And that's when you see it. The infamous poster of Mia Wallace on his bedroom wall. He has plain navy blue bed sheets, no hand soap in his bathroom. And that's when you should run, but you don't. And after dating for longer than you should have, you realise that actually, Tarantino fanboys are kind of awful. Tarantino's popularity has gone on an interesting journey. For as long as I could remember, liking his films was like an exclusive club. You could only know of him if you were a guy, if you were smart, cool, sophisticated, aware of underground film culture that no one else has heard of. But all of a sudden, it wasn't cool to like his films anymore. Pulp Fiction was basic. He wasn't really that unique and everyone had heard of him. So what happened? What caused this shift in opinion? After doing a bit of research, I found that you can trace the decline in his popularity with the rise of internet culture and social media, but more specifically, with more people being able to engage in discussions on his work. Social media has created a universal space for people to talk about film, and I think men were quite shocked when they realised that a lot of women don't really like Tarantino or the fan culture around his work. And they got quite triggered when girls started labelling Pulp Fiction as basic, because it dismantled this idea they had that they were special and intelligent for liking his movies. A lot of this was revealed when women started sharing their experiences with dating men who are self-proclaimed Tarantino fanboys, or what they're sometimes known as male manipulators. The term male manipulator was popularised on TikTok after some women started sharing their dating experiences and noticed some common red flags. The male manipulator can be described as someone who gaslights women and tries to hide his misogyny behind the facade of intelligence and sensitivity, but outs himself by revealing the kind of media he consumes. For example, a man who likes Radiohead and says Pulp Fiction is the best film of all time. I would say these red flag behaviours also extend to anyone who's a hardcore Christopher Nolan fan and says that Lady Bird wasn't even that good. But Tarantino fanboys are without a doubt the reigning kings of this territory. Here's a brilliant example from Ali Elkin's article, An Oral History of Quentin Tarantino as Told to Me by Men I've Dated.
Quentin Tarantino's movies have a lot of strong female characters. There's the bride in Kill Bill, Shoshana in Inglourious Bastards, the chicks that don't get murdered in Death Proof. I find that a lot of movies have female characters. Have you seen a movie?
The film industry is slowly trying to be more inclusive, and the internet has opened up spaces for anyone to engage in discussions on film, not just the people who Tarantino's movies were made for. His films have always been this very male-focused fantasy of the world, and with more people waking up to these unrealistic and sometimes toxic masculine ideals, maybe this style of filmmaking is becoming obsolete. People have recently been complaining that men are just not manly enough anymore. But the thing is, if you look back, people have always been complaining that men aren't doing enough, that being a man is something you have to earn through grueling physical labour and invulnerability. But if we can trace these claims back to the 1700s, then what does this say about these ideals in the first place? Have they ever been achievable? The idea of masculinity and the perfect man is a myth, keeping us in this hamster wheel of patriarchal values that forces us to chase something that has never been attainable. And it's this exact type of masculinity that is celebrated and worshipped in Tarantino's work. This idea of a man that is constantly doing, physically unstoppable, invincible to the law and to the effects of substances that are supposed to kill us. And I think that's why his films are so popular, because people want to live in that universe where they think this is real, where they think this is what men should be like. So maybe his decline in popularity is due to the fact that Hollywood is no longer as strict of a boys' club as it was before. There are more people who can join in and say, actually, maybe we can think of his work in this way, and maybe we can make films about this and this. Tarantino has made comments saying that there's been no good films made recently, but I think people like him are threatened because they're not the only people allowed in this club. There are new people in the game saying things he could never think of because he doesn't have the same experiences, and he's not the only person with something to say. Don't get me wrong, there are great aspects of his films, and I really admire his love of cinema and passion for filmmaking, but I think this shift in attitude towards his work is really healthy, as it shows that the film industry is trying to change, and thank goodness, because it makes it so much more interesting. In Tar, we see repeated shots of Lydia running. When I was watching it, I was slightly confused as to why we kept seeing this, but afterwards I realised it made us think, what is she running from? People have been trying to separate artists' creative and personal identities, that if you are a genius then it doesn't matter what you do in your personal life. We've seen it with people like Michael Jackson, Woody Allen, James Franco, and now Brad Pitt. But just like Lydia Tarr, they are trying to outrun their past, thinking that if they keep running, they can leave behind their personal identity and what they create will be enough. But this shouldn't be the case. Creative license and the idea of genius has been abused to keep people in power, allowing artists to hide behind their work. So, long story short, we are allowed to like Tarantino movies, but I think what's missing with the fan culture around his work is a bit of critical thinking, and I think lots of men worship his movies and Tarantino because subconsciously they're really drawn to the ideals in this universe. All of his characters seem to be invincible in the fact that they can do whatever they want and do bad things, but they can still flourish and thrive within that universe. And I think that his films act as a moral enabler for men to think that this is okay. So basically, I'm saying that if you're supporting Tarantino's work, then you're supporting these ideas that are in his movies. And if those ideas are in his movies, then it's because he believes them. Art and creating stuff is a very personal thing to do. So if you're supporting someone's art, you're supporting them as a person because their ideas and core values will be reflected in what they create. His movies don't exist within a vacuum. I think it's really wrapped into much wider issues, but they're able to be presented in films because people see it as something separate to what's going on in real life. When we release ourselves from the idea that genius is solely based on the outcome of a piece of work and the creative identity of the artist, I think we'll realise that most of the people we've labelled as being geniuses are just insecure people that feel like what they create is all they have to offer. Genius should be a merger of all these qualities that we should bring to filmmaking, because it is possible to be great at what you do and still be good. So here's looking at all the geniuses. I hope we see them make something different, something better, and hopefully something with less feet.